People are going back to this Terrence Howard clip and seeing something they missed because he didn't just say something random. He was pointing at something specific. And now that people are rewatching it, it hits very different.
I'm raising a really beautiful young man that will probably become the scientist I always wanted to become, just because I've sacrificed other things.
What if he comes to you one day and says, Dad, I really want to be in show business?
I will show him the business. I'll pull out old contracts and show him, I would prefer him not to.
Yeah.
Just because as an actor, the saddest thing, you stop experiencing moments. You start watching them as if you're storing them for a future reference. I don't know. I don't see the pain of life as much because I've played so many characters. And I think that's what happens to a lot of actors, and therefore they get hooked in drugs because they're desperate to get away from not feeling. They want to be excited or something. I don't know. It's a very strange thing, so I guess I still would steer them away from it.
That's one of the most extraordinary things I've ever heard.
Y'all, that clip is not from last week. That is Terrence Howard saying the quiet part out loud years before he had any reason to burn bridges. Before Iron Man 2, before the lawsuit, before the good slave quote, before any of it, he was already saying this. And here is the part that has people very quiet right now. Nobody was listening. That is what this video is about. Not the drama, not the fallout. This video is about what Terrence Howard was actually saying consistently, on record, across years of interviews, and why it took people this long to hear it. Here is what we are covering. The validation speech that started it all. The Hollywood silence code he described before anyone believed him. The moment he connected it all together, and the question everyone is now sitting with. Was Terrence Howard ahead of his time? Or did it take losing everything for people to finally hear what he was saying? Stay with me, because this is the part of the story most channels skipped entirely. Let's start at the beginning. Before Terrence Howard became a story about a career that collapsed, he was a man talking about why careers collapse in the first place. In older interviews from when he was still one of the most sought-after actors in Hollywood, he was already laying out a framework for understanding how this industry actually operates. He talked about validation, about how actors don't enter the entertainment industry because they love the craft. They enter it because they need to be seen, because something happened earlier, something that made them feel like they weren't enough. And Hollywood becomes the arena where they try to resolve that, where they try to prove to the people who dismissed them that they became somebody worth listening to. And here is the part that cuts deep. He said most of them are willing to do anything to maintain that validation, to trade away beliefs, to stay quiet about things they know are wrong, to absorb treatment they would never accept anywhere else, because the alternative is invisibility. And for people who entered the industry to escape invisibility, that is the most terrifying outcome imaginable. Now watch this, because this is the clip that changes how you see everything else.
Some people's God is money, because they do anything for it. They'll sacrifice themselves, they'll sacrifice their children, and they're willing to sacrifice all of that. A God is something that you will trade everything for. So most conversations on set are as shallow as you can imagine, because these actors, they're scared. We come into the business because, not that we want to perform, but we're hoping to be validated. So when you're on set, most of them has had to trade in a lot of their beliefs and the things they hold precious to themselves, because to get into that place, to get into that business.
Now sit with what he just said. He is not describing himself. He is describing the system, the invisible contract that most actors sign the moment they walk through the door. Fame and money and validation. In exchange for your opinions, your resistance, your unwillingness to be managed. Keep those things quiet or lose the access. And the thing about that contract is that it is never written down. Nobody hands you a document. It is communicated through what happens to the people who don't comply, through who gets called back and who doesn't, through which actors get labeled difficult and which ones get labeled passionate, through the way an entire industry can collectively decide to stop returning someone's calls without a single public announcement. Terrence Howard understood that contract better than most. He understood it well enough to describe it out loud, and understanding it did not protect him from it. And here is what makes those old clips so uncomfortable to watch now, because the man describing that system was still inside it when he said it. He had not lost Iron Man 2 yet. He had not sued Disney. He had not sat on a podcast and compared Hollywood to a plantation. He was still working, still successful, still invited to the rooms that matter. And he was already telling anyone who would listen that the rooms operate on a logic that most people are too afraid to name. Nobody paid attention. They heard it as insight, as a thoughtful actor reflecting on the industry. They did not hear it as a warning. They did not hear someone standing on the inside of a machine describing exactly how it works, while the machine was still running at full power. And here is the part nobody caught the first time. But this is where the whole story flipped. The pattern Terrence Howard was describing, the silence, the compliance, the trading away of self, he was not observing it from a distance. He was living it, narrating it in real time while maintaining his career inside the very system he described. That is either extraordinary self-awareness or the setup for a very specific kind of collapse. Because the moment he stopped performing that compliance, the moment he stopped playing the game, is the moment everything changed.
Are you still getting the knock of bigger projects coming your way?
Oh no, after I sued Fox and Disney, you go into the blacklist.
Permanent.
Until there's a new change of everybody inside of there. So you're no longer on their main list of calling because you've broken the cardinal rule, which is you never talk. Even if you're being screwed over, you never talk. You're supposed to keep that quiet and keep working as a good slave.
That quote from the PBD podcast landed like a grenade when it came out. But go back and listen to what he was saying in those older interviews. The language is different, the specificity is different, but the diagnosis is the same. He has been describing this system for years. What changed is not what he thinks. What changed is what happened to him. And what happened to him gave people a reason to actually listen. And this is the part most people don't want to sit with. Most people needed Terrence Howard to lose before they were willing to hear what Terrence Howard was saying. While he was successful, his observations were interesting. Once he was gone from the franchise, once the lawsuit failed, once he was sitting on a podcast with nothing left to protect, only then did the clips start circulating. Only then did people start going back through the archives and noticing that he had been saying this the whole time. Now, I need you to hold that for a second, because there is something inside that dynamic that goes beyond Terrence Howard specifically. When someone tells you the building is on fire and nobody believes them, and then the building burns down, the story we like to tell is that they were a prophet. We make it about their vision, but the harder truth is that we were the ones who were not listening, and we rarely examine why. We rarely ask what it was about the messenger, or the moment, or our own comfort with the information that made it easier to dismiss than to engage. Terrence Howard made it easy to dismiss him in some ways. His personality, his unconventional ideas on other topics, the way he sometimes pushed past the line of what felt credible. But none of that changes what he was observing about the industry. And none of that explains why the industry itself, the very machine he was describing, kept inviting him back until the moment it didn't. And here is the part that has me thinking. Terrence Howard was not a quiet man. He was not someone who struggled to express himself. He said it out loud with specifics in interviews that were recorded and published. And the industry, the same industry he was describing, kept giving him work, kept inviting him to the table, kept treating him as a welcome presence right up until the moment he stopped being useful to them. And then, almost overnight, the same man who had been articulate and insightful became someone people called unstable. That pattern, the moment when the narrative about a person shifts from thoughtful to unhinged, and the timing of when that shift happens is worth examining, because it almost always coincides with the moment that person stops being useful to the people in power. The insight does not change. The observations do not change. The man does not fundamentally change. What changes is whether the machine needs him. And the moment the machine decides it does not, suddenly the same words that were once described as honest and raw are now described as erratic and unstable. Pay attention to that shift, because it tells you something about who controls the narrative and who gets to decide what counts as clarity versus chaos. And this is the part people missed. Listen to how he says this, because it hits completely different now that you know what happened to him next. He has been consistent, interview after interview, different contexts, different hosts, different years. The framework he is using to describe Hollywood has not changed. What changed is the audience. What changed is the willingness to hear it. That one clip right there, the tribe concept, the allegiance system, the loyalty currency, that is the one people keep going back to. Because once you hear it framed that way, you cannot stop applying it to everything else you know about this industry. And now, after the PBD interview went viral, after the Beyoncé moment resurfaced, after the whole world spent a week debating whether to take him seriously or dismiss him, people are going back through the old clips, pulling interviews from 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And what they are finding in those clips is not a man who snapped. What they are finding is a man who had been building a very specific argument across his entire career. The same argument, refined over time, consistent in its core claim, and largely ignored until circumstances made it impossible to ignore. He told us, not just on the PBD podcast, not just recently, he told us years ago. In cleaner language, in a more controlled setting, with more to lose and nothing to gain from saying it. He told us, and we decided he was just being thoughtful, or dramatic, or difficult. We filed it under interesting interview and moved on. Here is my honest take. Terrence Howard is a complicated person. He has said things that are hard to defend. He has made claims that do not hold up under scrutiny. He has gone places in interviews that made reasonable people question his judgment. His credibility as a source on some topics is legitimately uncertain, but the observations he has been making about how Hollywood manages Black talent, about validation seeking, about the silence required to maintain access, about what gets traded away in exchange for a seat at the table. Those observations are not the product of bitterness. Those observations predated the bitterness by years, by a decade, by an entire career. And that distinction matters, because if these were just the words of a man who lost his job and needed someone to blame, you could dismiss them, but they are not. They are the documented, consistent, on-record observations of a man who made them while he was still winning, while he was still inside the machine, while the machine was still working exactly the way he said it worked. That is not a man rewriting history. That is a man who saw the history before it was written, and the history proceeded exactly as he described. He was saying it when he had everything to lose by saying it. That matters. And here is the question nobody is asking, but everybody should be. If Terrence Howard had stayed compliant, if he had kept his observations private, kept his head down, kept collecting the checks, would anyone be going back through these old clips right now? Would anyone be saying he was right? Or would he still just be the man who plays Lucius Lyon, quietly successful, never causing problems, and never forcing anyone to sit with what he actually believed? The uncomfortable possibility is that his fall is what gave his observations weight. That in a world where he never lost anything, he would have kept saying these same things forever and nobody would have cared. It took the machine chewing him up and spitting him out for people to finally hear the speech he had been giving for years about how the machine worked. Was Terrence Howard ahead of his time? Or did something have to happen to him before we would listen? Because one of those answers says more about him and the other says more about us. I want to know where you land on this. Drop your side in the comments. And if you are not subscribed yet, fix that right now. This channel goes deeper on the stories everyone else is skimming. With Terrence Howard, there is still a lot of story left to tell. Stay tapped in for more gossip.